I volunteered because the posting said, Cultural Liaison, and I had already done worse jobs for less pay and significantly more screaming. The application mentioned translation assistance, emotional presence, and patience. It did not mention womanhood, rites of passage, or the phrase, human emotional bonding, which I would later learn carried a legal, biological, and deeply embarrassing weight in this sector of the galaxy. The station itself was quiet in the way only alien architecture can manage, all smooth curves and soft lighting that made you feel like you were inside a well-funded meditation app. I was escorted through halls by officials who nodded solemnly at me, the way people do when they've already decided you're important but don't entirely know why. I assumed it was because humans had a decent reputation lately. Turns out, it was because I was about to be classified as a necessary component. That part came later. She was waiting in a room designed for what I assumed were interviews. Comfortable seating, a table, a dispenser offering beverages that glowed faintly in warning colors. She stood when I entered, posture perfect, expression serious in a way that suggested she had practiced it. She looked at me like I was a test she had studied for extensively, and was terrified to fail. She greeted me by reciting a sentence so poetic and intense that my translator lagged for a second, possibly out of second-hand embarrassment. Something about my presence igniting her journey and the convergence of destinies. I said hello and asked if she wanted to sit down. She froze. Then she slowly sat, eyes wide, fingers curling slightly like she was holding onto an invisible script. This was my first clue that something was off. She explained very carefully that she was nearing the threshold of womanhood. Not metaphorically. Legally. Biologically. Socially. Her species did not recognize adulthood in females until they completed an emotional calibration phase, and that phase required a human. Not just any human. A willing one. Apparently, we had been studied for decades and found uniquely suited due to what the official briefing later described as emotional inconsistency combined with stubborn empathy. I asked if this was a joke. The observers behind the glass did not laugh. She, meanwhile, looked relieved. She told me she had prepared extensively. She had studied human bonding behaviors, rituals, and expectations. When I asked where she'd gotten her information, she straightened proudly and said Earth literature, specifically romance novels. That was my second clue, and a much louder one. She leaned forward slightly, and asked me what I believed love felt like when it first bloomed between two souls destined to collide across the stars. I blinked, considered lying, and then asked if she wanted something from the beverage dispenser. She stared at me like I'd just performed a sacred gesture. As I poured myself something that looked like tea but smelled like regret, she explained that according to her texts, humans express bonding through dramatic contrasts. Silence followed by sudden intensity. Casual gestures loaded with unspoken meaning. Shared warmth in quiet moments. She said all this with the seriousness of someone describing nuclear physics. I told her romance novels weren't documentaries. She paused, then politely asked if that was a form of human denial. I tried to explain that most humans don't narrate their emotions like tragic poets. We don't brood in doorways or confess our feelings during thunderstorms. We get awkward. We make jokes at the wrong time. We offer drinks because we don't know what else to do with our hands. She nodded and typed furiously on a small device, labeling my explanation as deflection through humility. Every time I tried to lower expectations, she raised them by misinterpreting the effort. When I joked, she logged it as emotional masking. When I shrugged, she called it restrained vulnerability. When I told her I was just here to help with translation and support, she smiled softly and said, "Of course. Humans fear the depth of their own impact." Behind the glass, someone scribbled notes. The real problem became apparent when she explained the bonding phase was already in progress. My arrival, my tone, my willingness to listen, these were all being measured. Her emotional responses were shifting. Hormonal indicators were stabilizing. Neural patterns associated with adult cognition were forming. I had done nothing except show up and fail repeatedly to manage expectations. I asked what would happen if I left. She looked genuinely startled by the question, then quietly asked if humans often abandon partners during transitional vulnerability. I choked on my drink and waved my hands, clarifying that I was not a partner, that this wasn't romantic, that I wasn't doing anything special. She listened, eyes thoughtful, then said that according to Chapter 7 of one novel, denial often precedes acknowledgement. At that point, I realized two things. First, this was going to take longer than the briefing suggested. Second, I was already in way too deep, and all I had done was be polite and mildly confused. She thanked me for my patience. She said my calm demeanor was reassuring, my sarcasm intriguing, my presence grounding. She said she felt closer to womanhood than she ever had before. I stared at the wall, wondering how humanity had become a developmental milestone. Outside the room, officials smiled at me with something dangerously close to reverence. Somewhere in the galaxy, a classification system was probably updating my file in real time. And all I could think was that I really should have read the fine print. By the next cycle, she had adjusted her strategy. I knew this because she greeted me with a long, meaningful silence that lasted exactly long enough for me to wonder if the translator had broken. She held eye contact the entire time, unblinking, shoulders squared, breathing slow and deliberate. I shifted my weight, cleared my throat, and said good morning. She inhaled sharply, fingers tightening. You acknowledge the silence, she said reverently. The novels say this confirms emotional awareness. I acknowledged it because it was uncomfortable, I replied. She smiled. Not a casual smile. A radiant, purposeful smile, like someone checking off an important box. She noted something on her device and asked if I preferred my beverages warm or cool, because temperature, apparently, represented emotional availability in Chapter 12 of one book and suppressed longing in Chapter 14 of another. I told her I preferred coffee. She frowned slightly and asked which emotion that symbolized. I tried again to explain that humans are not symbols. We are not metaphors wrapped in denim. Sometimes coffee just means we are tired. She listened politely, nodded, and then wrote down. Human expresses vulnerability through exhaustion. Every interaction became like that. A maze of intent versus interpretation. If I leaned back in my chair, she recorded comfort and trust. If I leaned forward, she recorded interest and engagement. At one point I sneezed, and she paused the conversation entirely to ask if this was a sign of emotional overload. The observers were thrilled. They watched from behind the transparent barrier, whispering excitedly, pointing at data streams that meant nothing to me. My attempts to normalize the situation only added to the legend forming around me. I joked about it being awkward. They labeled it humor-driven intimacy modulation. She, meanwhile, was taking this very seriously. She practiced phrases she had memorized from her novels, testing them out carefully, like a student reciting lines in a play. She told me my presence stirred her thoughts like cosmic tides. I told her that was nice but unnecessary. She apologized and asked if I preferred a more restrained declaration of emotional resonance. I said I preferred honesty. That seemed to short-circuit something. She stared at me for a long moment, then quietly admitted she wasn't sure what honesty looked like without the script. That the novels had promised clarity, steps, escalation. They had made womanhood sound like something achieved through the correct sequence of glances and shared moments. Being faced with a human who disrupted that pattern by being inconsistent and self-deprecating was challenging. I told her that sounded about right for humans. She laughed. Not the practiced one she'd been using, but a sudden, surprised sound that escaped before she could analyze it. The room paused. Sensors spiked. Somewhere, an alarm chimed softly and was immediately shut off. She covered her mouth, eyes wide. That wasn't planned, she said. Congratulations, I replied. You've just had an authentic human moment. She logged it, then hesitated, and deleted the entry. That became the turning point, though neither of us realized it at the time. She started asking questions that weren't lifted from novels. Small ones? Unscripted ones? Why humans joked when nervous? Why we downplayed our own importance? Why we helped even when we weren't required to. I answered as best I could, fumbling through explanations that contradicted each other because, frankly, humans contradict themselves constantly. Apparently, this was fascinating. She told me her people valued precision. Emotional states were measured, anticipated, guided. Womanhood was not something stumbled into. It was achieved through correct alignment. Humans, on the other hand, seem to fall into emotional bonds sideways, by accident, often while trying to avoid them. I shrugged and said we trip into meaning all the time. She stared at me like I'd just summarized an entire philosophy. At one point, she offered me a carefully prepared meal, explaining that sharing sustenance was a bonding ritual in her culture. I accepted because it would have been rude not to, and because I was hungry. She watched me eat with intense focus, noting my reactions, my casual gratitude, the way I didn't make it ceremonial. Later, I learned that act alone had advanced her biological markers significantly. I tried to pull back after that. I reminded her that I wasn't special. That any human would behave similarly. That I wasn't guiding her toward womanhood, I was just being myself. She listened, then asked softly if being oneself was the most human act of all. I didn't have a good answer for that. The elders convened a small meeting to inform me that the process was exceeding expectations. She was progressing rapidly. Her emotional stability had increased. Her self-referential awareness was deepening. The models did not account for sarcasm, shared meals, or casual conversation about nothing in particular, yet here we were. They thanked me? That made me nervous. Back in the room, she seemed calmer. Less performative. She told me she felt settled. That the pressure to do womanhood correctly was easing. That she didn't feel like she was acting anymore. She asked if that was normal. I told her normal was overrated but comfort was a good sign. She smiled again, softer this time. No notes. No device. And in that moment, I realized the worst part of all of this wasn't that I was accidentally fulfilling a galactic rite of passage. It was that, despite my best efforts to avoid it, I was doing it simply by being human. By the third cycle, something had shifted. The intense, scripted behavior I had come to expect from her began to soften into something unpredictable. She no longer referenced chapters or plot lines or phrases from badly translated Earth novels. Instead, she asked questions that required me to think, which was dangerous because humans are terrible at thinking on demand. "Why do you laugh when things go wrong?" she asked one afternoon as we sat in the observation room. I nearly choked on my drink. "Well," I said cautiously, "because it's usually the only thing you can do without crying. And sometimes crying doesn't fix the problem either." She tilted her head and considered this. Then she asked, "So humor is a survival mechanism?" "Yes," I said. "Sort of." She typed something into her device, but this time there was no judgment, no formal categorization. Just a quiet note. I realized then that she was learning to process information outside of the novels and outside of any preset structure. She was beginning to understand humans on their own terms. Her questions started to get harder. Not emotionally, exactly, but fundamentally. Why do humans persist despite repeated failure? Why do humans apologize even when they haven't done anything wrong? Why do humans listen to someone who confuses them endlessly? I tried to answer each question honestly. I said humans are messy, contradictory, stubborn, and capable of kindness. I said we often act without complete understanding because we hope for the best. I said that sometimes we accidentally do the right thing, and sometimes the world punishes us anyway, but we try again. She nodded slowly. So, womanhood is not a series of perfect steps, but rather a recognition of one's own capacity to endure and adapt. I blinked. I think that sounds about right. That admission seemed to unlock something in her. The next hour was spent with her describing her feelings without metaphor, without flowery language, without any reference to romance novels at all. She described fear, hope, curiosity, and self-doubt. She described realizing that she didn't need someone to guide her every step, she just needed to observe, reflect, and choose for herself. And yet, through all of this, she still seemed to measure progress according to how I responded. My habitual awkwardness, my sarcastic remarks, my impatience with bureaucracy, they all served as indicators for her. I had accidentally become the emotional benchmark, not because I was extraordinary, but because I was consistently human. During one particularly quiet moment, she looked at me and said, "I think I understand now. Humans are flawed, but intentional. They stumble, they err, and yet they continue to exist with empathy intact. Perhaps that is what the novels were trying to communicate without ever realizing it." I laughed softly, realizing that she had essentially summarized half of human literature in a single sentence. Yeah, that's us in a nutshell. Not always graceful. Never consistent. But somehow we keep going. Her smile was almost shy this time, genuine, unforced. And through observing you, I have matured. Not through adherence to ritual, not through imitation, but through witnessing humanity itself. I didn't know what to say. Mostly because no one had ever explained humanity to me in quite that way before. She had absorbed the lessons I didn't think I was teaching, understood nuances I didn't think I was expressing. And yet, somehow it worked. Later, she confided that the ceremonial observers were in disbelief. The official metrics didn't match her progress. According to their calculations, she should have been stuck in early emotional stages for weeks. Yet she had accelerated past them simply by interacting with me in an unscripted, unpredictable way. "I don't know why," she admitted. "Everything I studied said this would be difficult. But observing humans, it's enlightening. And surprisingly comforting." I shrugged. "Humans are like that. We don't always know what we're doing either." She laughed softly at that, a sound so light it made me realize that the absurdity of our situation had passed into something genuinely joyful. She wasn't performing anymore. She wasn't trying to emulate romance novels. She wasn't waiting for some cosmic checklist to be completed. She was simply herself. And somehow, interacting with me, a completely average human, had guided her into the next stage of her life. That night, as I walked back to my quarters, I reflected on the absurdity of the situation. A human volunteer, clueless and sarcastic, had helped an alien woman achieve maturity simply by being genuine. No rituals, no lectures, no mystical guidance, just presence, conversation, and flawed empathy. It struck me then how human resilience worked. Not through perfection, not through discipline, but through consistency, kindness, and the ability to navigate chaos while remaining aware of one's own failings. That was what had made the difference. That was what had guided her. I thought about all the romance novels she had studied, the elaborate gestures, the misinterpreted metaphors, and I realized that she didn't need any of that after all. She didn't need dramatic declarations or tragic intensity. She needed ordinary human behavior, the messy, imperfect kind that somehow still carried meaning. And in that, I found a strange pride. Not in myself, exactly, but in humanity. In our absurd ability to survive, to connect, to matter without realizing we're being measured. Somewhere in the galaxy, we were being recognized not for power, not for technology, not even for strategy, but for being human. For being inconsistent, for laughing in the face of awkwardness, and for accidentally teaching maturity by failing beautifully. By the time she finally looked at me and said, "I feel complete," I realized I hadn't even noticed when the rite had actually occurred. It wasn't a moment of fireworks or ceremony. It wasn't even a single decision. It was a slow, ridiculous, extraordinary process that had crept up unnoticed, like the way humans learn without realizing they've grown. And as I nodded, feeling both exhausted and honored, I understood that this was the best part of being human. We weren't flawless. We weren't predictable. We weren't always impressive. But sometimes, just by being ourselves, we could change the universe for someone else without ever intending to. By the fourth cycle, the official ceremony had arrived, though calling it a ceremony was an overstatement. There were lights and soft music that sounded like wind chimes on top of helium balloons, a podium, and a semicircular arrangement of observers who scribbled notes, with expressions of awe. I was standing off to the side, feeling distinctly underdressed for a galactic rite of passage. I wasn't sure what my role was supposed to be, supporting witness, accidental guide, or unwitting hero, but apparently it didn't matter. She approached the podium with a poise that now seemed natural, effortless. The awkward tension of earlier cycles had vanished, replaced by a quiet confidence that made me realize she had internalized everything without even trying. She spoke slowly, deliberately, not like a student reciting a textbook but like someone recounting a journey that had actually been lived. Her words were clear and precise, yet infused with a warmth that made the observers blink and adjust their metrics. She explained, without embellishment, what she had learned about herself, about her culture, and inevitably, about humans. "We have studied humans for generations," she began, "through texts, translations, and simulations. But nothing prepared us for the truth. Humans are not perfect, not elegant, not always intentional, but their very flaws are instructive. By observing one human, we have understood that adulthood is not a series of tasks or rituals. It is measured by understanding, by adaptation, and by the capacity to endure and connect despite uncertainty. I have learned this because of one volunteer, whose inconsistencies have guided me more effectively than any manual." She paused, and I noticed she looked directly at me, as if expecting a reaction. I shrugged awkwardly, offering my best. "I didn't do anything." Smile. She nodded politely and continued. "This human has not taught me through theatrics, romanticized gestures, or pre-planned scenarios. No, his humanity, imperfect, contradictory, occasionally sarcastic, and utterly genuine, has been sufficient." Somewhere behind the glass, an observer gasped. Others scribbled notes, with urgency, attempting to understand how metrics had been shattered by simple presence. I caught a glimpse of one scientist whispering something like, "It's almost as if just being human is enough." The speech ended, she stepped down, and the observers conferred quickly. A soft chime sounded, indicating official recognition. She had entered womanhood. I exhaled, mostly from relief, partly because I had been standing far too long, and partly because I wasn't sure I could survive the intensity of being described as a cultural milestone. She came over, a little shy this time, and thanked me. Not in a dramatic or romantic way, but sincerely. "I could not have achieved this without your presence. Without your absurdity, your sarcasm, your genuine inconsistency, I might still be lost in ritual and pretense." I muttered something about not knowing how I'd become a rite of passage, and she laughed, a gentle, unstudied laugh that was contagious. Outside the room, news of my accidental achievement spread. Other species had already submitted requests for humans to assist in their rites of passage. Apparently, I had set a precedent. I was simultaneously terrified and flattered. I thought of declining, but somewhere in my gut, I realized that humans had become, by default, a universal standard. Not because of strength or intelligence, but because we were resilient, empathetic, and absurdly consistent in our inconsistency. The alien woman watched me struggle with the idea of a galactic waiting list and said simply, "Humans have a strange power. They teach without intending to, and they guide without realizing it. That is why we need them." I considered that as we walked through the corridor back to my quarters. The building, once imposing and formal, now felt less intimidating. The weight of expectation had shifted. It wasn't on her anymore, and oddly, it wasn't really on me either. Somehow, humanity's natural behavior had sufficed to bridge a cultural chasm spanning light years. Later, as I packed for the trip back to my regular assignments, I thought about the absurdity of it all. I had volunteered for a vague liaison program and ended up shaping an alien woman's adulthood by doing what humans do best: stumble through interactions, laugh at awkwardness, show kindness where it wasn't expected, and maintain a stubbornly grounded sense of self. She found me again before I left, holding a small device that translated her words for me. "I have assessed the humans," she said, smiling. "They are inconsistent, confusing, and sometimes exasperating. And yet, they possess an indomitable capacity to influence without instruction. I respect this." I nodded, realizing that respect was probably the understatement of the millennium. I said goodbye, half expecting this to be the end. She waved, though she paused as if uncertain what the gesture meant exactly in human terms, then smiled broadly, a mixture of pride, relief, and amusement. As I left the building and stepped onto the transport shuttle, I glanced back. Somewhere along the way, humans had become a universal touchstone for emotional development. Not through superiority, not through force or cunning, but through being ourselves, messy, imperfect, sarcastic, kind, and resilient. I sighed, half amused, half bewildered, and thought, well, that's humanity for you. Not perfect, not scripted, not even fully understood, but somehow capable of guiding an entire species into adulthood by sheer existence alone. Somewhere in the galaxy, our reputation was quietly soaring, and all I had done was show up, drink glowing beverages, and answer awkward questions. And maybe, just maybe, being human was enough.